Hi, I'm Tom White. I'm the president of the MIDI Manufacturers Association. The MT32 was actually designed for what they call desktop music making, so for an individual to sit down with a computer and create music. But the president of Roland US actually was on the board of directors of Sierra Online, the gaming company, and he thought that it was a great opportunity for games to try to take advantage of that sound capability. And at the time, the only other thing was the Sound Blaster. Actually, I think it was the Game Blaster. I don't even think it was Sound Blaster. So it was his initiative to get Sierra Online to start doing some games for the MT32 that actually made it launch the whole MT32 for games. It was a high-end thing. Anybody who really liked sound in the games would buy them. Sierra Online sold them themselves. They would sell a $195 Game Blaster and a $795 MT32 kit, but people were buying them. And eventually, I think the one game that actually really launched it was Wing Commander. They demonstrated that at a CES show or Comdex, and actually had a big television and a huge sound system and blasted the sound into the aisles. And then people said, "Oh, I had no idea a game could sound like this." But again, it was an expensive piece, so it was only the people who really cared about sound. It was an actual synthesizer. Unfortunately, and I don't mean to denigrate Yamaha at all, but they developed that chip that was used in the Game Blaster and Sound Blaster for some very inexpensive, not sound quality applications. So, and that's what people picked up on. And that's why for many years people said, MIDI sounds bad. It came from that one particular chip because it wasn't designed to sound good. They were just trying to create, tones. And the difference was the MT32 was an actual attempt to take Roland's existing technology and put it down into a chip that was small enough to be affordable for other applications like this desktop music application. So there are certain ways that specific things that happened in the gaming industry that did affect the musical instrument market. I'm not so sure I would say that the affected the development of technology so much as more the way people looked at sound sets and content in general. So for example, the whole general MIDI thing really came out of the gaming market. There was also a karaoke market. Any market that's driven by content was the issue. So somebody just wants to make songs that they can distribute. You have to know, well, what are you going to play them back on? And so there has to be a standard platform. And karaoke is one of those things, but games turned out to be one of those things too, because the game developers wanted to be able to just sell the game and have the content just work no matter what system the customer had. And that's why you needed to have something like General MIDI. And then another way that games actually pushed that envelope was then the game developers started saying, well, I don't want to write all my games with just these 128 sounds. I want to be able to put my own sounds in there. And so the whole downloadable sounds, which wasn't invented just for games, but that's where that whole idea really grew from, came out of that desire. It was really just simply the matter that there was only a certain number of sounds and there was no consistency. So for even the Sound Blaster versus MT32, so a game developer would have to actually create a different score for each card because the instrumentation was different and it all sounded different. And for a period of time, and then Microsoft really also helped push that along because when they came into the market with the multimedia multimedia extensions for Windows, which was where they added sound and CD-ROM, they realized that they had to have some sort of a standard, patch set or program set. And at that time, so there would have been three. There would have been the MT32, the Sound Blaster, and whatever Microsoft came up with. But that's where the MIDI Association gets involved because representing the entire musical instrument industry, we went to Microsoft and said, please don't do a third one. In fact, in the industry, we are now gravitating to this thing we're calling General MIDI. And for content delivery, everybody will author to the General MIDI set, and we'd like you to support that as well. And they did. Badly, actually. I would say, unfortunately, the MIDI Manufacturers Association did not do a great job of combating that, primarily because we don't have a very strong outward-facing effort. Mostly it's dealing with the manufacturers, helping them to figure out how to make everything interoperate, creating new messages in MIDI, new recommended practices, things like that. And the outside perception of MIDI is something that, of course, we're aware of, but again, we just don't have the mechanisms to deal with it. So for the most part, all we did is we would repeat things that we heard to our members and complain about it and try to get them irritated so they would do something, which wasn't all that effective. But it does help, because once the industry was aware that that was the perception, then when an opportunity came up, like maybe to go speak at a conference or even to sit down and talk to potential suppliers, then we would do that. And myself, I was working, both while I was working at Roland and also doing consulting after Roland, I would often go in and sit with computer companies, because the whole gaming thing brought a whole bunch of different people into this musical instrument industry. Computer companies, chip manufacturers, consumer electronics companies, speaker manufacturers. They're all going, wow, this whole gaming thing is really cool. And so they all wanted to make synthesizers and get into that business. And I would spend a lot of time explaining to them why that sounds bad, but that's not MIDI. And I would have to show them products that did sound good. It was important, but actually, interestingly enough, maybe the most important thing wasn't so much general MIDI as the sound canvas itself, because the sound canvas was the first general MIDI product, and it was very well promoted by Roland. Roland took advantage of that opportunity and went out and pushed it as the general MIDI product, and started going to game conferences and showing off the sound canvas, to the point where, in fact, one of the first things the IA-SIG did, which maybe we should discuss what the IA-SIG is at some point, was to actually issue a statement saying that as far as the gaming industry was concerned, the sound canvas is the reference for general MIDI, and that's what you should actually author to. So that was much more significant, and there were some specific cases. There was a computer company that I went to one time to help a chip manufacturer explain why their solution was a better solution than somebody else's, and what we used was the sound canvas. I took the sound canvases and said, well, this is what the content's supposed to sound like. Now listen to this and listen to this, which one sounds more correct? So it wasn't so much general MIDI as it was the sound canvas, I think, that really helped everybody figure out what they're supposed to be doing. Oh, sound canvas, yes, is essentially the new version of the MT32, which we didn't explain either, but assuming anybody knows what an MT32 is, the sound canvas is the general MIDI version of MT32, different sound set and a different synthesis technology, much more advanced. So the IA-SIG was formed. George Sanger says, I actually started it, George. Yeah, that's what it means. It was a cooperative effort. What happened was, shortly after the sound canvas came out and game developers started really becoming interesting in general MIDI and music synthesis, other things were happening too with sound system. Apple started to get involved more heavily in games. And then there became these platform conflicts. So a game developer wants to make a game that runs on a Mac and also runs on a PC, but the audio systems function differently. So they go, wait a minute, can't we find some way? It's just sound, it's just waveforms. So there were issues like, how do you do mixing and how do you keep the mixing levels the same? And the solution to those things is to get those people together, not just Apple and Microsoft, but all the game developers who are trying to do things too and trying to solve problems and creating their own solutions. Michael Land at LucasArts, and get them all together and say, okay, all together, is there some way we can do this the same way? And that's what the IA-SIG was formed to do. There was this awareness that all these companies were struggling to make everything work better and work compatibly, and there needed to be a forum where they could get together. So that's what it was. It was started at GDC in what Tom Reddig had something called the Audio Town Hall Meeting, which was sort of like a wolf in sheep's clothing. It was presented as if it was just an opportunity for people to talk, but the actual idea was, he knew going into it that he needed to rally these people together and say, look, that we should do this all the time. And we had spoken before the session and said, yeah, we need to formalize whatever comes out of this. And while we were sitting there in the session, they were bringing up issues that some of us had been talking about, and I was talking with George, and George said, I'll take care of this, and stood up and said, here's what we should do, and then announced the whole idea of, having this interactive audio special interest group, which at the time wasn't the name, but he just said, we should all do this, and we should define what general MIDI sounds are, and we should come up with a downloadable sound specification. And he just listed all that stuff, and that was it. Everybody said, that's a great idea, let's just go do that. So downloadable sounds was the answer to the problem that general MIDI, even though it sounded a lot better than MT32 or the Sound Blaster, it still had a fixed number of sounds. And so if you're writing music and you needed an instrument that wasn't in the general MIDI set, what did you do? So the obvious solution is you can't use the general MIDI set. You'd have to use some other synthesizer. And many synthesizers in the professional market support general MIDI sounds, but they also have other sounds, but not in the gaming market, because the games, they were trying to just figure out how to make something that, a box, and sell the box and be done with it. Some of them were programmable. Sound Blasters were all programmable, the new wavetable-based ones at that time, but not every manufacturer could do that. And even then, you were still limited to whatever sounds that the manufacturer happened to put on that synthesizer. And if you actually had your own idea of a sound, there was no way to just do that. So it wasn't rocket science to say, well, why don't we just give people the ability to create their own sounds and deliver those sounds along with the game? And that's what downloadable sounds was. So there the challenge was, again, you have to get all the synthesizer manufacturers together to agree to support that particular format. And because the IASIG was being run by the MIDI Manufacturers Association, we had that conduit. And so there was a constant communication back and forth between IASIG, which was representing the game developers and hardware makers and software makers, and the MIDI manufacturers representing the actual synthesizer developers. And we figured out how to do this DLS, downloadable sounds. Actually, the next one was 3D positioning, because it didn't take long for everybody doing games to realize that for virtual reality, sound needs to be all around you. Obviously, it would be nice to have the visuals in 3D too, but that wasn't possible until recently with VR stuff. But sound at least was possible because you could put speakers in different places, and you could use all kinds of tricks with binaural listening to make sounds appear in different places. But again, everybody starts doing it a different way, and the game developers say, I don't want to have to write the game for every individual piece of technology that's out there. So at the time, it was mostly Creative Labs and a company called Oriel, who were the market leaders. And but there were a handful of other companies, maybe 3 or 4 other companies, plus Apple and Microsoft, again, as the platforms at the time, had to be able to support the APIs. This was really before Sony and the Xbox became, dominated that field. At the time, it was still mostly computer games. So we had to get all of them together to agree on a particular set of instructions for how to position sound in 3D space. Yeah, second one came along because, and this is something that the MIDI Manufacturers Association does very much like we did with games, where we saw the opportunity and then tried to, and then sometimes, again, it was in that case, it was Roland who really got in there first, but then became the entire industry. Once we see an opportunity where MIDI can be applied and provide some benefits, then we try to insinuate ourselves into that market. And the whole Downloadable Sounds 2 came out of MPEG, which is the filming and downloadable streaming content format. They decided they wanted to have the opportunity to do what they called synthetic audio, which basically they just meant they wanted to be synthesizing things so you could stream instructions and down at the television receiver or something, it would just create sounds. And when we heard about that, we kind of went, well, isn't that what we do? So we went to them and said, you should just use what we're doing. And through their own contributions, they said, well, we'd like more advanced features, a few things. So we built a second level that was more suitable for their market. So one of the reasons MIDI became popular in computers in the first place was because it's very low bit rate. It takes very little, very small messages to create the sound, because it's a model where instead of streaming the actual sound data, you're streaming instructions to a synthesizer that resides at the receiver end. So the synthesizer is a lot more complex than a wavetable, audio producer is, or a sound engine is. but you've offloaded that to the device instead of having to stream it. So anytime where bandwidth is an issue, MIDI can become very useful. And that was the issue with computers. It was very difficult to send anything back and forth, so they used MIDI. Same thing happened with phones. Once Nokia said, these things should have customizable sounds, it didn't take them long to figure out, well, we're not going to stream these sounds across the networks. It's just not going to happen. So they came to the MIDI Association and said, we want to use MIDI in the phones, but we don't want to use general MIDI. It's like huge. You know, we can't put these huge synthesizers in every single phone. So could we have a small subset? And again, they wanted a standard so that you could buy any phone, it would just work. So the low bandwidth thing is where MIDI often comes back into the market. So it came back into computers, it came back into cell phones. Today, what's happening though is actually more of a resurgence of musical instruments. One of the things about digital musical instruments is which is what MIDI does. As soon as you separate the performance aspect from the sound aspect, and especially if you digitize that, which is what we've done, it opens up, it changes the world completely. It used to be if you wanted to play a musical instrument, you had to go find a thing, and you had to hit it, blow it, whatever, until it generated sound. And that was pretty much the entire experience. Now, I don't mean to minimize that. Obviously, doing that well takes years and years of practice, and it can be a great experience, but it's still very limited to just that. When you digitize the process and you separate the playing, I can strike anything, blow anything, whatever. I can make a globe with a bunch of buttons on it, and then just send digital data to anything else that can read it. It can be any kind of a synthesizer. Now you can play a musical instrument of any kind on anything, and that's just a completely different experience. And as digital technologies have improved over the years, and now you have a computer in your pocket, the capabilities are incredible. Now anybody can just take an iPhone or something and go, here, I'm making a musical instrument. And again, the language for doing that was defined way back in 1983 with MIDI. That's what MIDI was. It separated the keyboard from the synthesizer and said, well, this is how the two things will communicate. And it did such a good job that 30 years later, it's still perfectly adequate for doing that. So the future is actually what's most interesting, I think. One of the things that happened, although the protocol is basically the same after 30 years, transports have changed. There was no standard transport for anything back in 1983, actually. Now we have dozens of standards, USB, etc. So MIDI has been moved over different transports. It's over USB, it's over FireWire, there's ways to do it over Ethernet. And that makes it more accessible to more people, because sometimes you have a platform or an application where you need a particular transport. The internet is one, for example. If you can do something over Ethernet, that means you can possibly do it over the internet itself, which opens up whole new possibilities. So we're constantly working on how to make sure that when MIDI is used on new transports, that it's used in a consistent and interoperable manner. That takes a lot of work. Today, the transports that are most interesting are radio transports, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. That's a real challenge for something like MIDI, where everything is very timing critical. When you hit a button, it's got to sound immediately, not when the thing wakes up, sends a radio signal, something interferes with it, sends it again, which is how radio works. So that's a big challenge, but that is absolutely the future. Everything's going to go wireless, and we know that. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And then the other thing is, I guess, being a victim of our own success. Once you develop this whole digital musical instrument paradigm where things can be separate, and anything can be an instrument, then people start to get creative and they go, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could have an instrument that works in 3 dimensions or works in 4 dimensions, whatever that would be. I don't know. I mean, there's no limit to what people can create. And the challenge there is that MIDI was designed to do this. You press a key, it sends a signal. And there's no, what if I move my hand this way, or what if I'm moving my arm like that? I mean, you just start thinking about those kind of things. And many of them can be addressed and handled by MIDI messages, but sometimes you get to a point where you go, yeah, but it really wasn't designed for that. So there will be a point in the future, which we're already predicting and working on, where we will need something that's very much like MIDI but has extra capabilities to address the new and weird things that people are doing, which, you know, they may not ever be commercially successful, but that I think is also part of the change in the model. It used to be that, you know, if you can think of them, guitars was a big thing, synthesizers was a big thing. It used to be you had to come up with the next big thing. I don't think that's the musical instrument business anymore. I think the musical instrument business now is everybody does their own thing. And as long as it all works together, that's all that matters.